Welcome to the crash course on the 10 plagues on Egypt, the most open display of God's hand ever in human history. For a period of 1 year, the Egyptians and the Jews witnessed miracles that tested every assumption about the nature of existence and reduced Pharaoh into a silly fool that stubbornly tried to hold on to his version of reality. But why did God need to bring 10 plagues? He's all powerful. He could have easily achieved our freedom with 1 plague. And instead of hardening Pharaoh's heart, he could have simply softened it. The key to understanding the significance of the 10 plagues is to appreciate their place within the greater context of human history. The physical universe was brought into being through speech. In fact, the Torah identifies 10 different things God said to fashion reality as we know it. On the other hand, the spiritual realm was introduced to the Jewish people at the foot of Mount Sinai with the 10 commandments. The bridge that enabled the Jewish people to traverse the natural world of cause and effect and commit to live in a deeper spiritual realm and engage with the Almighty directly was the 10 plagues. Step by step, the plagues peeled away one layer of reality after another, and one by one, the Jewish people got closer to the source of their existence. Eventually, the 9th plague of darkness matched the creation of light, and the final plague of death of the firstborn brought them back to the moment of beginning. Ultimately, what resulted from the 10 plagues was a new beginning, a nation called Israel, which the Almighty referred to as his firstborn. And from this point forward, that nation that experienced God as the sole basis of reality realized how truly free it was to serve him and become a light unto the nations. That's why the Passover Seder were instructed to recount and relive the experience as if we had been there ourselves. Because the more we see and appreciate how far God went to demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt his presence, awareness, and total control, the more liberated we each become to be courageous and moral in our choices as Jews. So let's take a walk down memory lane. The Torah tells us that Pharaoh denied the very existence of God. The goal of the first 3 plagues was to settle the score. The Nile was a god of the Egyptians because it was everything to the Egyptians. If God had performed another plague first, the Egyptians could have easily rationalized it was the Nile god that was performing it. But by turning the Nile into blood, killing the fish, staining the land red, and filling the air with a rotten stench, God demonstrated that the Nile was nothing but a servant of his will. And for an entire week, the only water that was available to the Egyptians was that of the Jews, and that's if we agreed to sell it to them. Then God made the Nile produce millions of frogs as an attack force. God transformed the timid frog into an aggressive creature that swarmed the land and tormented the Pharaoh and the Egyptians with a deafening noise. For the Jews, it was poetic justice because they recalled how their masters used to make them hunt insects and reptiles for sport. But instead of giving in, Pharaoh was busy trying to convince his people it was only magic by getting his sorcerers to produce some frogs. Then, with the stench of decomposing frogs still in the air, without warning, God transformed the dust of Egypt into lice, and every Egyptian was covered head to toe with these tiny creatures. This intense suffering was measure for measure for being brutal masters that wouldn't let the Jews wash or bathe despite their work in the fields and dirt. And this time the magicians couldn't duplicate the plague. The creature was too tiny to conjure. Then the next set of 3 plagues came to demonstrate God's absolute authority over the land. The Egyptians had lorded themselves over the Jews, taking pride in their wealth and property. That was to be no more. God sent hordes of wild animals to rule the streets, attacking and killing any Egyptian that wasn't barricaded in. Then a month later, pestilence struck, and every animal, whether healthy or sick, passed away. And finally, without warning, the Egyptians were struck with painful boils. And remember, it wasn't one Egyptian or many Egyptians, but every Egyptian suffered for taking part in physical acts of cruelty against the Jews. With all this chaos going on around them, where were the Egyptians to look for stability? To the heavens? Not anymore. The next 3 plagues demonstrated that even the skies were merely a reflection of his will. A miraculous hail that combined fire with ice bombarded Egypt for a week. And then a month later, a swarm of locusts descended and consumed everything that was left on the ground. And then a month later, without warning, an eerie, dense darkness descended over Egypt that froze the Egyptians in their place. And yet, while the Egyptians were stuck, the Jews were provided with light so they could search for the Egyptian homes and find the treasures. Even things as fundamental as light and darkness could be manipulated by the Almighty at will. The 9 plagues had taken almost everything away from the Egyptians, but there was still one thing to hold on to: their future, their leadership. The political class had every family provided with the birth of their firstborn. And then in one instant, at midnight, on the eve of the Exodus, while the Jewish people were celebrating their first Passover, Egypt was completely wiped out. And God had demonstrated that life and death were not the result of some earthly process that takes its toll over time. Instead, they were pure expressions of his will, nothing more. As Egypt lost its future, the Jewish people inaugurated theirs. We were free because the 10 plagues successfully liberated us from false perceptions. I'd like to conclude the crash course with one question. Why doesn't God continue to reveal himself in an open way like he did with the 10 plagues in Egypt? Well, the short answer is it would completely overwhelm us. We would lose our independent will, and that is not their goal. Instead, it was to give us an experience of his presence that showed us how much he loved and cared for us, to make us his nation and give us his Torah. And the Torah is a greater revelation of his will than even the 10 plagues in Egypt. And throughout history, the Jews have seen that for those who choose to learn it, keep it, protect it, and cherish it, God's active presence is always felt. Enjoy your Seder, taste the freedom, and be grateful for our remarkable and miraculous past. It's the basis of our future. Happy Passover and next year in Jerusalem.